Out west, where the land stretched wider than most hearts knew how to hold, there lived a woman named Edith May. She was not thin, never had been. She was round in the hips, soft through the arms, and carried a belly that made seamstresses frown and men smirk before they turned away. They called her big boned when they wanted to be polite, too much woman when they didn't, but no one ever called her beautiful. She'd learned early that kindness didn't come easy to women like her, that benches creaked when she sat too fast, that laughter often followed her back, that dresses with buttons down the front never quite made it to the last one. But she stayed kind. She stayed helpful. She stayed even when no one ever stayed for her. Then one day she sent a letter to Wyoming Territory, to a man named Roy who said he wanted a wife to help on a small farm. Someone practical, someone honest. So Edith told him the truth. "I am not small," she wrote. "I will not fit in corsets or your pride, but I can cook and I can work and I can love steady if you'll let me." Weeks passed. Then came the reply, "Come if you like. I'll be waiting." She arrived in her best dress seams, tugging curls pinned just so heart steady, but Roy wasn't there. Just a folded paper at the station. "Didn't expect you to be so fat." "I've changed my mind." That was it. No name, no apology, just shame. Edith sat on that wooden bench with her carpetbag in her lap while children pointed and someone laughed behind a hand. But she didn't run. She didn't cry. She bought herself a coffee, stood up taller than anyone expected, and walked away. Not home, not defeated, just forward. Because somewhere in that wide and quiet land, there was someone who wouldn't measure her waist before deciding if her heart was worth knowing. And when she met him, he wouldn't see too fat. He'd see a woman built for carrying the kind of love that doesn't break under pressure. Have you ever been judged before they knew your name? Or told you were too big too much? Too something before anyone saw your heart? Then maybe you should come sit with us a while. Because this isn't just Edith's story. It might be a little bit yours too. Let's begin. What happens to a woman when even her hopes arrive in someone else's name? In a dusty corner of Nebraska, where trains coughed soot and the prairie wind forgot to be gentle, lived a woman named Edith May Campbell. She was 42, soft around the edges with hands made for holding and eyes that hadn't been looked into in far too long. She wasn't the kind of woman men wrote songs about, not the kind they boasted of bringing to town socials. She was what some called a good worker and others whispered was too much woman for a small life. Edith had learned to keep her chin high while the world looked away. She sewed for others, cooked for neighbors, smiled politely when children whispered behind her back at the general store. Kindness lived inside her, but she'd learned to keep it tucked beneath quietness. It was safer that way. Then one day a letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to her. It had been slipped into her parcel by mistake. She could have handed it back, should have, but something made her open it. A man named Roy Mercer from Wyoming Territory, writing to inquire about a mail-order bride. He wanted honesty, he wrote, a strong woman, one who could work a homestead and didn't mind a man with silence in his bones. Edith knew it wasn't meant for her. But that night, she wrote back anyway. She told the truth, gave her real age, included no photo, only words like, "I am built broad and built kind. If you need a slim waist, I cannot offer it. But if you need steadiness, you may find it here." 3 weeks later, a reply came. "Come if you wish, I'll be waiting." So she went, left before she could talk herself out of it. But when she arrived in Green Hollow, Roy wasn't there. Just a folded note at the depot window. "Didn't expect you to be so substantial. I changed my mind, that was all. Not even signed." Edith stood on that platform for 3 hours before the station agent finally asked if she needed help. She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I'm just remembering something I almost believed." She didn't cry. She bought a cup of coffee, sat alone, and then she rose. Because this wasn't the end. It might not even be the worst of it. But somewhere beyond this shame, there was still her dignity. And maybe a new beginning. Some women are told they are too much for this world, but sometimes too much is exactly what a quiet heart has been waiting for. But where does a woman go when even the place that promised to want her turns its back? Where does a woman go? When the world hands her back, her hope crumpled, and unsigned Edith walked. Not toward anything, just away. Away from the station. Away from the platform where her shame had settled like dust on her coat. Away from the paper that said substantial like it was a flaw, not a form of grace. She followed a narrow trail where the land dipped behind the depot and met a small creek. The water moved quietly, unlike the voices in her head. By the time the sun began to sink, she'd found a patch of grass beneath a cottonwood. She built a fire the way her grandmother taught her, slow, patient, without fear. She boiled tea. She didn't cry, because there was no space for breaking down when no one was there to help you back up. At dawn, she laced her boots, repacked her satchel, and walked along the creek's edge. That's when she heard the splash. A little further down, a man stood ankle-deep in water, cursing softly as he wrestled fishing line from a willow branch. His shirt was worn, his boots muddied, and his beard touched with silver. He didn't see her at first, so she made a soft sound with her throat, not wanting to startle, just to be seen. He turned and paused. She braced herself for the shift in eyes, the downward glance, the politeness forced into distance. But it didn't come. He just nodded once and said, "Mornin'." No judgment, no flinch. "Good morning," she replied, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. He stepped out of the water and pointed toward a stump near the bank. "I've got coffee going if you don't mind it burned." Edith hesitated, then stepped forward, because for the first time in days, someone had offered her a place to sit without asking her to be smaller. They shared silence over tin cups. He told her his name, Caleb Monroe. A widower, lived alone just over the ridge, said he came to the creek most mornings because fish didn't ask questions. She didn't tell him what had happened, but maybe she didn't need to. He didn't fill the air with chatter. He just sat, stirred the fire, offered her the last piece of cornbread with no apology. That afternoon, as she turned to leave, he said, "You're welcome to come by sometime. I've got more coffee than company." She smiled, small but real. "Maybe I will," and that was all. But it was enough. Sometimes the softest beginnings come after the loudest rejections. And the gentlest men don't need to fix you. They just don't walk away. But what happens when the old voices come back, telling her she's still too much even for kindness? What do you do with kindness when you've been taught it never comes without cost? Edith returned the next morning, not because she planned to, because her feet took her there, because her hands, still raw from carrying the weight of rejection, itched for the simple warmth of that tin cup, and the silence that didn't feel like punishment. Caleb was already there, seated on the same log, coffee bubbling in the dented kettle beside him. He looked up, almost surprised, then pleased in a quiet, weathered way. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said. "I wasn't either," she answered. They didn't talk much that morning. She mended the hem of her coat while he fished. They shared cornbread again. He didn't compliment her. He didn't ask questions she didn't want to answer. He just made space, and that somehow was the most unnerving thing of all. Because Edith had learned to brace for looks, for insults laced in kindness, for the word dear said like it meant burden. Now, with each act of quiet respect, Caleb offered pulling her cup before she reached brushing leaves off the stump. Before she sat, her heart grew tighter, not looser, as if waiting for the punchline, as if wondering when the kindness would turn sharp. That night at the small boarding house she'd found above the bakery, she sat by the window and whispered, "Don't be foolish. You know how this ends." But the next day she went back, and the next. One afternoon, while gathering stones for the fire ring, her skirt caught on a jagged root and tore. Caleb bent to help, hands brushing hers. She pulled back too quickly. He paused, didn't touch her again. "Sorry," she said, voice too tight. "You don't need to apologize," he said gently. "Not for guarding yourself." That night she cried, not for Caleb, for the part of her that had forgotten what gentleness could sound like. A week later, he invited her to see the garden behind his cabin. "I won't be much of a host," he said, "but it's quiet. You might like that." She followed him up the ridge path. The cabin was small but sturdy, the garden wild and half-tamed, like someone had tried their best and decided beauty was allowed to be messy. She sat on the porch steps while he whittled something she couldn't yet name. After a while, she asked, "Why did you invite me?" Caleb didn't look up. "Because you don't flinch at quiet," he said. and I've grown tired of being loud to be heard." She didn't answer, but she stayed until sunset, and she didn't flinch when he handed her the carved shape, a small wooden heart rough around the edges. He didn't say what it meant, and she didn't ask, but she slipped it into her pocket like it belonged there. Sometimes the hardest thing is not surviving cruelty. It's trusting softness when it finally comes. But what if she lets the kindness in and it disappears just like before? How does trust begin, not with a promise, but with someone who doesn't leave? The days pass slow and steady, like the way autumn folds into winter without asking permission. Edith kept returning to the ridge, sometimes with bread wrapped in cloth, sometimes just her presence. Caleb never asked her to explain. He simply made space, and slowly something inside her began to loosen. Not the kind of loosening people praised, not the letting go of weight or size, but the loosening of shame, of flinching, of always watching for the door to close. One morning she brought her sewing kit to patch a rip in Caleb's shirt. She sat at his kitchen table, weathered wood one corner, slanted from years of elbows. He made coffee and didn't ask why her hands trembled when he handed her the mug. Instead, he said, "The first time I saw you, I thought, here's someone who's stayed kind longer than most people stay alive." She looked up, startled, not by the words, by the way he said them without performance, without pity. That afternoon, they picked apples from the small orchard behind his cabin. She climbed the ladder. He held it steady. And when she laughed deep and unguarded because a squirrel startled her, Caleb laughed too. It wasn't pretty. It was real. Later by the fire, she handed him a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Just something to keep you warm," she said. Inside was a pair of mittens she'd made stitched from wool and patience. He slid them on, looked at his hands. "I haven't been given something like this since—" He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need him to. They sat quietly and the wind shifted through the trees like a song only the mountains knew. "I'm not used to this," she whispered, being seen and not being asked to change. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You're not something to fix, Edith. You're someone to know." She exhaled, and for the first time in years she believed it. Some healing doesn't come with ceremony. It arrives on the porch in the way someone looks at you when you're not speaking and stays. But can this quiet be trusted when so much of her life has taught her to brace for the storm? What do you do when the past catches up to you, and this time you don't feel the need to apologize for surviving it? It was a Tuesday when he came, a man from town riding up the ridge road with a cloud of dust behind him and a question already on his tongue. His name was Charles Withers, a clerk from the Green Hollow post office. He came looking for Caleb about a boundary dispute or a shipment mix-up, something that didn't matter. But when he saw Edith sitting on the porch with her mending basket, he paused. His gaze ran over her, not curious, calculating. And then came the smile. Not kind, familiar. "Miss Campbell," he said, drawing out the syllables. She nodded stiffly. "I remember you. Came through on the late train, didn't you? That mail-order bride fellow turned away. Left a note about—" What was the word? His eyes sparkled. "Substantial, wasn't it?" The world tilted. Not because the words hurt, though they did, but because part of her had always feared that someone someday would name aloud the humiliation she tried so hard to bury beneath fresh starts and quiet mornings. Caleb stepped out from the cabin. He'd heard. He didn't raise his voice, didn't ball his fists. He simply walked over to stand beside her shoulder to shoulder and looked at Charles as if he'd asked a question no one was obligated to answer. "We're not interested in old stories," Caleb said calmly. Charles blinked. "Didn't mean nothing by it. Just seems folks should know they don't need to." Caleb interrupted. Then he turned to Edith. "You don't have to sit through this." But Edith didn't stand up. She didn't shrink back. Instead, she looked Charles in the eye and said, "I'm not ashamed of who I was, only that I thought it made me unworthy of this." She gestured to the porch, to the cabin, to the small good life she had chosen. "I thought I had to hide in order to be welcome somewhere. Turns out, I just had to walk far enough away from people like you." Charles didn't know what to do with that, so he muttered something and turned his horse around, dust trailing behind him like regret. Caleb sat beside her, said nothing. Just let the wind fill the space between them. You didn't have to defend me, she said. I didn't, he replied. I stood beside you. There's a difference. She nodded, tucked her needle back into her basket, and stitched the last seam of her fear shut. Some victories aren't loud. They happen on porches under open skies when the woman who once apologized for her body chooses not to apologize anymore. But what comes next when the shame is gone and there's finally room for joy to grow? How do you know you belong when no one asks you to prove it? It started with an apron. Simple, worn, striped in faded blue. Edith hung it by the back door of Caleb's kitchen, not because she was staying, just because it made sense. She had been baking bread that morning, and flour had found its way onto everything but the dough. She'd planned to leave after supper, return to the boarding house, keep her world intact and separate. But as she untied the apron and hung it gently on the nail, something in her paused. She stood there, fingers still curled around the hem, and realized she'd never left anything behind in a place she didn't hope to return to. That evening, they sat across from each other at the table. She passed him a plate of roasted squash, and he slid her the salt without needing to be asked. The fire crackled. The clock ticked. And neither of them reached to fill the silence, because it wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. After the dishes were cleared, they stepped out onto the porch. The stars blinked overhead like someone had poked holes in the dark to let the light through. I'm not afraid anymore, Edith said. Caleb looked at her. Of what? That you'll disappear once you've seen enough. He didn't smile, didn't rush to reassure her. He simply said, there's no such thing as enough when it comes to you. Her throat tightened. She'd waited a lifetime to hear something like that. But more than that, she'd waited to believe it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the wooden heart he had carved weeks ago, held it between her palms, turned it over like it was sacred. I kept this, she said. I know. I didn't think I could trust softness. I don't blame you. She looked at him then, not just with gratitude, but with choice. You haven't asked me to stay. I wouldn't dare. And if I chose to, I'd hang your apron on a stronger hook. She laughed, then cried, and then without fear, without shrinking, she stepped forward and laid her head on his shoulder. Not because she needed to, because she wanted to. And that more than anything else was the turning point. Some love stories aren't written in vows or rings. They're stitched into the ordinary, an apron left by the door, a quiet supper shared a porch where no one walks away. But will this quiet love hold? When the seasons turn and life asks what comes next, Edith was once told she was too big for love, too wide for someone's pride, too soft for a world that only praised what could fit neatly into lace and expectation. But love, real love, was never meant to be about the size of a waist. It's about the size of a heart. And the man who saw her didn't see a woman to shrink. He saw a woman to stand beside. Because sometimes the gentlest love comes not from being chosen first, but from being seen completely and not turned away. If you've ever felt overlooked or told you were too much or not enough, may Edith's story remind you, you are never too much for the heart that's meant to hold you. If this story touched something tender in you, we'd love for you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, where stories of quiet strength and second chances find a home. Tell us in the comments, would you like to see what comes next in Edith's journey or hear another story like hers? Share this video with someone who's ever felt unseen. We read every word you write, and maybe your story's waiting to be told too. Until then, dear friends, stay gentle, stay hopeful, stay exactly as you are.